Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Today, we will explore the dark mountains of North Carolina, where the silent forests guard secrets that challenge all understanding. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Does anyone know the Appalachian Mountains? It was the winter of 1913. Snow began to fall over the isolated villages of Madison County, North Carolina, laying a white blanket that obscured the paths between log cabins. At that time, the Appalachian region was a world of its own. Families lived far apart, separated by miles of dense forest and trails that vanished among towering pines. There were no telephones, no paved roads. Communication relied on messengers on horseback and the goodwill of neighbors. Nora Whitaker was only 23 when her name became synonymous with terror in those mountains. She was the daughter of a lumberjack and a midwife, growing up in the misty valleys of Hot Springs, a small community known for its thermal springs and the railroad threading through the hills. Locals described Nora as a beautiful young woman with long brown hair and light eyes that seemed to mirror the constant mist of the highlands. Yet there was something disturbing about her, a profound silence, a gaze that made people look away. The Whitaker family lived on a remote homestead, about 5 miles from the nearest village. The house was simple, built of oak planks, with a rusty metal roof that groaned in strong winds. All around stood trees, hundreds of ancient trees, creating perpetual shadow even during daylight. Nora's father, Samuel Whitaker, was known for his explosive temper and for drinking homemade whiskey until he passed out. Her mother, Martha, spent her days in quiet, assisting in the delivery of local babies, carrying a worn leather bag filled with herbs and instruments nobody liked to examine closely. Nora had 2 younger brothers, Thomas, 17, who worked alongside his father felling trees, and little Elizabeth, just 9, who still attended the makeshift school at the Hot Springs Baptist Church. The family dynamic was strange. Neighbors reported rarely seeing them all together. Conversations with any Whitaker encountered on the trails were brief, almost hostile. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors in places where isolation turns every gesture into a story. It was in February of that year that everything began to change. The winter was particularly harsh. Nighttime temperatures plunged well below zero, and deep snow made travel arduous. Nora had married 6 months earlier to a man named James Mercer, a blacksmith from the town of Marshall, about 15 miles away. The wedding was a subdued affair on a rainy August afternoon, with few guests. Some said James seemed excessively nervous. Others noted that Nora did not smile once during the ceremony. After the wedding, Nora moved into James's house in Marshall. It was a nicer building than the Whitaker home, with 2 bedrooms and an attached workshop where James repaired tools and shod horses. But something was amiss. Women at the local store began to notice bruises on Nora's face and purple marks on her arms. She wore scarves to cover her neck, even on warm days. When questioned, she would look away and mumble about having fallen. James changed, too. The once sociable man who attended town meetings became withdrawn. He stopped going to church. His once busy shop saw fewer and fewer customers. Some claimed to hear screams from the house at night. Others swore they saw Nora walking barefoot along the road, even with snow on the ground. Yet nobody intervened. In those days, what happened inside a home was a private matter. Authorities did not involve themselves in domestic disputes, and the community preferred to look away. Then came that February morning, the 17th, a cold and cloudy Saturday. Mr. Elijah Parsons, the grocer in Marshall, did not see James Mercer arrive for his usual weekly supplies. He thought it odd, but dismissed it. Only the next day, with another absence and the shop still closed, did concern grow. Elijah asked his son, an 18-year-old named Robert, to check on the Mercer house. Robert rode down the snow-covered road, the chill seeping into his bones. Upon reaching the property, he noticed something unsettling. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. No smoke rose from the chimney, meaning no fire was lit. He called for James. Silence. He called for Nora. Nothing. Heart pounding, Robert dismounted and approached the entrance. What he found inside would alter the history of Madison County forever. Robert Parsons stood in the doorway for several seconds, trying to comprehend the scene. The main room was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned. Broken dishes littered the wooden floor. Dark stains led toward the back of the house. The air hung heavy with an unidentifiable odor, a mix of something metallic and something rotten that turned his stomach. He called out again, his voice weak and trembling. Robert was young and had never encountered such a sight. He stepped further inside, avoiding the dark stains. The fireplace was cold, its ashes scattered as if someone had rummaged through them. On the table sat a pot of food scraps, already molding. Flies buzzed despite the intense winter cold. Then he heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound from the bedroom at the back of the house. Every muscle in Robert's body tensed. He picked up a piece of firewood near the hearth and moved slowly down the narrow hallway. The bedroom door was closed, but the sound persisted. A dragging noise, something moving slowly against the floorboards. He grasped the doorknob, took a deep breath, and opened it. Nora Whitaker sat in the corner, hugging her knees, rocking back and forth in a rhythmic, unsettling motion. Her dress was torn and soiled, her hair tangled over her face. She did not look at Robert. She just kept rocking, mumbling too softly to understand. The room was a wreck. The mattress ripped, goose feathers everywhere, floorboards torn up in places as if dug out by bare hands. Robert moved closer, calling her name gently. Nora didn't respond. Only when he was a few feet away did she lift her head. What Robert saw in her eyes made him recoil instantly. There was nothing there. No emotion, no recognition, just a deep emptiness that seemed to drain all light from the room. And then she smiled, a slow, crooked smile that did not belong. Robert fled the house. He mounted his horse and galloped back to Marshall as if chased by the devil. By the time he reached the grocery store, he was pale and barely able to speak. His father had to splash cold water on his face before he could stammer out what he had witnessed. Between sobs and broken sentences, Robert described the chaos. Nora alone in that corner, and James Mercer's total absence. Elijah Parsons acted swiftly. He gathered 4 men from the community and headed to the house, taking lanterns, ropes, and weapons. Dusk was falling when they arrived. The shadows of trees stretched across the snow, forming sinister shapes that seemed to move. The door still swung open in the icy mountain wind. The men entered together, lighting every corner. Nora remained in the same spot, but now seemed aware of their presence, watching every movement with those empty eyes. When Elijah asked where James was, she simply pointed to the floor. The men exchanged confused glances. One of them, a farmer named William, noticed loose floorboards near the bed. He knelt and carefully lifted them. An unbearable smell rose from the opening. William backed away, covering his nose. The others approached, shining their lanterns into the cavity beneath the floor. At first, they could not comprehend what they saw. Scraps of fabric, something resembling part of a boot. Then, amid the shadows and earth, they recognized it. It was James Mercer, or what remained of him. The body was curled in that cramped space, bent unnaturally, limbs forced to fit. Without closer examination, the exact circumstances were unclear. But one thing was certain. James Mercer had been dead for days, and Nora had been in that house alone, rocking in the corner, while her husband's body decomposed beneath the floor. The men arrested Nora without resistance. She did not speak, cry, or react. She allowed them to bind her and place her in a wagon. All the way to the jail in Marshall, she sat staring vacantly, that crooked smile still fixed on her face. People watching from Main Street stood silent as the wagon passed. Rumors spread before it even disappeared around the bend. That night, Madison County Sheriff Harold Benson, a 52-year-old veteran of the Spanish-American War, was summoned. He had seen terrible things, but nothing prepared him for the Nora Whitaker case. At her cell, he found her just as described, sitting on the stone floor, rocking, mumbling incoherently. Harold tried to question her, but it was like speaking to a wall. In the following days, the county coroner, Dr. Vincent Graham, examined James Mercer's body. His report shocked all who saw it. James had not died quickly. Multiple bone fractures indicated repeated beatings. Some wounds showed signs of being inflicted over several days. Most disturbing was the absence of defensive wounds, as if James had been incapacitated from the start. But how could a woman of Nora's size, about 100 pounds and 5'6", overpower a blacksmith weighing over 180 pounds? This question circulated among the locals. Some recalled rumors about Nora's mother, Martha Whitaker, and her midwifery practices. They whispered that she knew herbs that could heal or paralyze, that she held secrets passed down through generations of mountain women. Sheriff Harold decided to investigate further. He sent 2 deputies to the Whitaker homestead in Hot Springs, but the house was empty. Samuel, Martha, Thomas, and little Elizabeth were gone. They had taken almost nothing. Clothes still hung, food remained in the pantry. Tools lay abandoned. It was as if they had vanished into the night without a trace. Authorities searched the entire region, questioning every village and remote farm, but no one had seen the Whitaker family. They had melted into the mountains like morning mist. Some believed they fled to Tennessee via trails known only to locals. Others feared something worse, that the forest had swallowed them and their secrets. Meanwhile, Nora remained in her cell, drifting further from reality. She stopped eating, refused water, and would not sleep. She simply sat, rocking and mumbling. The prison doctor tried to force-feed her, but she spat it out. Within 2 weeks, she was gaunt, her bones visible under pale skin. Then, one night in March, something extraordinary occurred. In the early hours of March 22, 1913, the night guard at Marshall County Jail, Peter Sullivan, heard a new sound from Nora Whitaker's cell. It was not her usual murmur. It was a clear, articulate voice, speaking in a normal tone. Peter rose from his chair and went to the bars. What he saw stunned him. Nora stood upright in the center of the cell, arms at her sides. Her eyes, once empty, now gleamed with a disturbing intensity in the dim lamplight. She looked directly at Peter, fully aware for the first time in weeks. When she began to speak, her voice held a strange quality, as if multiple people spoke through her at once. She told a story Peter Sullivan would never forget. Nora said James Mercer was not the gentle man people believed. From the first night of marriage, he revealed his true nature. The beatings started in the 2nd week. The bruises townsfolk noticed were only the surface. James would lock Nora inside for days, without food or water, just to watch her beg. He burned her skin with hot irons from his workshop when she argued. He told her she was his property, bought from her father Samuel for 3 horses and $50 in gold. Peter listened, torn between horror and doubt. Nora continued. She said one night in January, during a particularly violent episode, something inside her shattered. It was not a conscious choice. It felt as if another entity took control. She remembered fragments, holding something heavy, the sound of breaking bones, the sudden silence. But the most disturbing part came next. Nora said she was not alone when it happened. Voices guided her hands, whispering instructions, granting her unnatural strength. Voices she had known since childhood. Voices her mother Martha had invoked many times in their isolated mountain home. Voices of the ancients, of those who inhabited these lands long before settlers arrived. A chill ran down Peter's spine. He had heard tales of the Whitaker family's practices, of rituals in hidden clearings, of Martha's impossible cures, of stillborn children reviving after she whispered words in unknown tongues. He had dismissed them as superstition. Now, looking at Nora, he was no longer sure. Nora then did something that froze Peter's blood. She raised her hands, palms down. Even in the faint light, he could see Mark's ancient scars forming symbols, interlocking circles, intersecting lines in complex geometric patterns. She said these marks were made when she was 7, part of a pact borne by all Whitaker women, a legacy passed from mother to daughter for countless generations. Peter stepped back, his legs weak. He wanted to run, to call the sheriff, to wake someone, but he stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze from the frail woman whose presence now seemed to consume the entire cell. Nora smiled, but it was no longer that vacant, crooked smile. It was a smile overflowing with knowledge, power, and something akin to pity. She told Peter that what happened to James was only the beginning, that there were more bodies, many more, hidden in the mountains, buried in places where the snow never fully melts, where the roots of ancient trees had already consumed flesh and bone, turning everything into part of the forest. She mentioned names travelers who had vanished over the years on the trails between Hot Springs and Marshall, traders who never reached their destinations, a traveling preacher last seen at a small wooden church near the Whitaker property. Peter finally found his voice and asked, trembling, how many there were. Nora tilted her head as if counting. Then she said a number. 17. 17 people over 9 years. She and her family had worked together, following the voice's instructions, feeding something ancient that dwelled deep within those mountains, something that demanded tribute, something that promised protection, prosperity, and power in exchange for blood. The guard staggered from the cell block. He vomited in the hallway. His hands shook so violently he could barely light a cigarette. When Sheriff Harold arrived in the morning, Peter sat outside the jail, pale as a ghost, unable to form complete sentences. It took Harold nearly an hour to extract the story, and even then, he struggled to believe it. But Harold Benson was not a man to ignore clues. He assembled a group of 12 armed men, all experienced in the mountains. They brought shovels, ropes, rudimentary maps, and a notebook where Peter had scribbled the places Nora mentioned. The expedition set off the next day under a cloudy sky, the fog so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The first site was about 4 miles from the abandoned Whitaker property, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that blocked most sunlight, the ground covered in years of accumulated pine needles. Harold ordered them to dig at a spot marked by a large triangular stone. They didn't need to dig deep. Less than a meter down, they found human remains, partially decomposed bones, and scraps of clothing time had turned to rags. The accompanying medical examiner estimated the remains had been there at least 3 or 4 years. Identification was impossible without further investigation. They moved to the second site, then the third. At each, the same macabre discovery: bodies in various stages of decay, some reduced to skeletons, others preserving mummified tissue from the constant high-altitude cold. At the fifth site, they found something that made even the toughest men recoil: the body of a child, a girl no more than 10 or 12, judging by her dress remnants. The news spread through Madison County like wildfire. Newspapers from cities like Asheville sent reporters. The Nora Whitaker case transformed from a local matter into headlines across North Carolina. People arrived from afar, curious and morbid, wanting to see the woman who had confessed to ritual murders. Pressure on Sheriff Harold mounted exponentially. State authorities got involved. A special prosecutor was assigned. They wanted answers, justice, and above all, to find the rest of the Whitaker family. For if Nora spoke truth, and there were indeed 17 victims, several bodies remained undiscovered, and the true nature of events in those mountains needed understanding. Search teams were organized. Dozens of men scoured the area for weeks, following every lead, investigating every suspicious clearing, digging where the ground seemed marked. They found 5 more bodies, bringing the total identified victims to 10. But the other 7 were never found, and the Whitaker family remained missing, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. After her night of confession, Nora returned to her previous state, silent, distant, rocking in her cell corner. Attempts to make her speak again failed. The examining doctor declared her in a state of deep, perhaps permanent shock. Debate erupted over her mental competency for trial. Some lawyers argued insanity, others that her confession proved consciousness. Meanwhile, strange occurrences began in Marshall. The first signs were subtle. A dairy cow found dead without cause. The blacksmith who took over James Mercer's shop, hearing rhythmic knocks beneath the floor at midnight. The grocer's wife waking with the sensation of someone watching from her bedside, finding no one. The townsfolk whispered. They said Nora's presence in jail was attracting something, that the ancient entities her family served were searching for her. The Baptist pastor held prayer vigils, but the strange events continued. Children began having identical nightmares of a long-haired woman walking the streets, entering homes, touching sleepers, leaving red, burn-like marks that faded by dawn. Sheriff Harold tried to maintain order, but even he felt the weight. His own 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, woke screaming one night, pointing at the window, swearing she saw a woman floating outside, gesturing as if weaving something invisible in the air. Harold saw only darkness and falling snow. On April 12th, exactly 52 days after James Mercer's body was discovered, something changed the investigation entirely. A hunter named Thomas Edison, unrelated to the inventor, was hiking high mountain trails over 15 miles from Marshall when he came upon a cabin he was certain had never been there before, though he knew those mountains intimately after 30 years of hunting. The cabin was small, built of dark, ancient-looking logs, with no windows and a low door secured by a simple bolt. Thomas felt something strange as he approached, the air denser, heavier. The ever-present birdsong was absent. Even the wind was silent, as if nature held its breath. He pushed open the creaking door. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and what he saw made him drop his shotgun. The walls were covered in symbols, the same symbols Nora bore on her palms, interlocking circles, lines, forming impossible geometric patterns that seemed to shift when not stared at directly. In the center stood a makeshift altar, a flat stone on wooden pegs, and upon it lay objects. Many objects. Thomas forced himself inside. On the altar were clothing scraps belonging to missing travelers, a gold pocket watch from a cloth merchant who vanished 4 years prior, a small Bible engraved with the traveling preacher's name, strands of different colored hair tied with red thread, and at the center, a doll. But it was no ordinary doll. It was fashioned from twisted branches bound with animal sinew, dressed in human clothing scraps, with real hair sewn onto its head, long brown hair, like Nora Whitaker's. Thomas lifted the doll with trembling hands. It was unnaturally heavy. Turning it over, he saw words carved into the wood on its back, words in an unknown language, with strange vowels and consonants non-existent in English. He tucked the doll into his coat and fled, not stopping until he reached Marshall deep in the night, panting and wide-eyed with terror. Sheriff Harold examined the doll by lamplight in his office, summoning the coroner, prosecutor, and even the pastor. None could explain it. The engraved language was unknown to all. The pastor suggested a corrupted mix of Latin and indigenous dialects, but he was uncertain. Everyone agreed it had a purpose, likely connected to Nora. They decided to confront her with it. The next morning, Harold, accompanied by the prosecutor and doctor, went to Nora's cell. She sat rocking in her usual corner, eyes fixed on some distant point. Harold showed the doll through the bars. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Nora stopped rocking. Her body went rigid. She slowly turned her head toward the doll, her eyes widening. For the first time in weeks, she showed emotion, not fear or surprise, but a deep, primal rage that distorted her features, rendering her almost unrecognizable. She threw herself against the bars with impossible force for her weakened state, making the iron vibrate. Nora began to scream, not in English, but in the same guttural, painful-sounding language engraved on the doll. The doctor recoiled, pale. The prosecutor made the sign of the cross. Harold tightened his grip on the doll, fighting to maintain composure, though he too felt the urge to flee. The scene lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it began, Nora stopped. She returned to her corner, curled into a fetal position, and lay still. Now she was crying, silent tears streaming down her dirty face. Harold put the doll away and left the jail with the others. For several minutes, no one spoke, each processing what they had witnessed. The prosecutor, a pragmatic man named Richard Ashford, suggested seeking experts, perhaps a university professor of anthropology or history, knowledgeable in ancient religions and occult practices. Harold agreed, sending telegrams to the University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill, and other institutions. A response came 3 days later. A professor named Dr. Edmund Thatcher, an expert on Appalachian Native American cultures, agreed to travel to Marshall. He arrived on a rainy April afternoon, a thin man in his early 40s, with round glasses and a leather briefcase full of books and notebooks. Harold took him directly to the office where the doll was stored. Dr. Thatcher examined the object for hours, taking notes, consulting his books, comparing symbols. When he finally looked up, his face was grave. He said the doll was ancient, not in age, but in practice, representing rituals predating European colonization, traditions never entirely forgotten. He explained that among some pre-colonial Appalachian tribes, there were traditions of spiritual binding rituals, where a person could tether their life essence to an object. This object served as an anchor, offering protection from certain harms, but also meaning whoever controlled the object held sway over aspects of that person's life. Dr. Thatcher believed the doll was exactly that, an anchor for Nora Whitaker, likely created by her mother Martha during the childhood ritual that left the marks on her palms. This would explain her superhuman strength against James Mercer, her survival without proper nutrition, and perhaps her connection to the presences haunting Marshall. The professor then suggested something that shocked everyone. Destroying the doll might free Nora, but it could also kill her, as breaking such a deep bond might cause fatal shock. It was a terrible gamble. Keeping the doll meant leaving Nora trapped. Destroying it might free her or be her death sentence. Harold faced the most difficult decision of his career. He consulted the prosecutor, the doctor, the pastor. Each had differing opinions. Some argued Nora deserved death for her crimes. Others saw her as a victim controlled by forces beyond her understanding. The debate raged for days. Meanwhile, the strange events in Marshall worsened. On the night of April 23rd, something happened forcing Harold's hand. Prosecutor Richard Ashford's 12-year-old daughter, Catherine, vanished from her bed. The family woke to find her room empty, the second-floor window open, yet no footprints in the snow-covered yard below. Catherine had simply disappeared. The town panicked. Search parties combed every house, barn, and, well, calling her name to no reply. Hours turned to days. Richard Ashford neared collapse. His wife wept uncontrollably. Harold felt the crushing weight of responsibility, certain this was connected to Nora. It was then Dr. Thatcher made a desperate suggestion. Use the doll as a bargaining tool. If a true connection existed between Nora and the object, perhaps it could be used to find Catherine. The idea was risky, bordering on foolish, but Richard was willing to try anything. They went to Nora's cell with the doll. This time, Harold didn't just show it through the bars. He entered the cell, something no one had done since her arrest. Nora was huddled in the corner as usual, but when Harold approached holding the doll, she raised her head. Her eyes were not blank. They were alert, calculating, waiting. Harold knelt a few feet away, placing the doll on the floor between them. He spoke firmly but respectfully. He told Nora he understood she was connected to the events plaguing the town, that a child was missing, and if any humanity remained within her, she would help bring the girl back. In return, he pledged they would find a way to help her as well. Nora remained silent for many minutes. Then, slowly, she reached out toward the doll. Harold did not stop her. The moment her fingertips touched the object, her entire body stiffened, as if struck by an electric current. She closed her eyes and began to whisper, this time not in that strange language, but in fragmented English, as if speaking in a trance. She spoke of a cave in the mountains, near a stream that ran red from iron ore in the soil. Inside that cave was a natural chamber, where the walls gleamed with crystals. There lay Catherine, alive but in a state of deep sleep. Nora explained the girl had been taken as an offering, that the presences her family served were hungry, and the Whitakers' disappearance had broken the cycle of tributes. Now the ancient entities were taking what they needed on their own. Harold noted every detail. He asked for the way. Nora described the route with surprising precision, a trail heading north from Marshall, running 5 miles into the forest, crossing the creek 3 times, ending at a steep slope where the cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of ancient roots. She urged them to hurry. Catherine only had until sunset. After that, it would be too late. Harold gathered 10 men, including Prosecutor Richard. They took ropes, flashlights, weapons, and all equipment they could muster quickly, and set off immediately. The path unfolded exactly as Nora had described. After hours of arduous trekking through dense, damp forest, they found the stream. The water indeed had a reddish tint, as if mingled with blood. They crossed it 3 times, their boots soaking, the cold seeping into their bones. The steep slope appeared before them. It took over an hour to climb, using ropes for support. At the top, they found exactly what Nora mentioned, a thick curtain of roots hanging from a rocky ledge, completely concealing what lay behind. Richard was first to push the roots aside. The cave entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for 1 man to pass. The air flowing out was cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something organic and disturbing. The men switched on their flashlights and began their descent. The cave interior was a maze of natural tunnels. The walls dripped constantly, creating echoes that distorted all sound. They followed the main tunnel, cautious of the slippery floor. After about 100 meters, the tunnel opened into a large chamber, and there, just as Nora had said, the walls glowed. Quartz crystals reflected their flashlight beams, creating a spectacle of light that made the cavern seem alive. In the chamber's center, Lying on a flat stone surface was Catherine Ashford. She still wore her nightgown. Her feet were bare and dirty. Her hair splayed around her head like a golden halo. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully, breathing slowly, but she did not wake when called. Richard ran to his daughter, lifting her, shouting her name. The other men surrounded the stone, shining lights into every corner, searching for any threat. But there was nothing. No animals, no people, only the sound of trickling water and the ethereal crystal glow. Richard tried to wake Catherine, shaking her gently, splashing water on her face, but the girl did not respond. The attending physician, Dr. Vincent Graham, quickly examined her. Her pulse was weak but steady. Her body temperature was low. He could not determine what kept her unconscious. There were no injuries, no suspicious marks. It was as if she simply could not or would not wake up. They decided to get her out immediately. Richard carried his daughter the entire way back, refusing to let anyone else hold her. When they finally emerged from the woods and reached Marshall, night was falling. They took Catherine straight to the doctor's house, where he had proper equipment. Catherine remained unconscious for 2 full days. Her mother never left her bedside. The doctor tried every treatment he knew, but nothing worked. It was as if the girl's consciousness was trapped somewhere distant, unable to return. On the 3rd day, in desperation, Harold had an idea. Perhaps the answer lay with Nora again. He returned to the jail with the doll. This time, his approach was different. He did not ask. He demanded. He told Nora she had fulfilled part of their agreement by revealing Catherine's location. Now she needed to complete the task. She needed to bring the girl back. Nora looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge and sadness. Then, surprisingly, she agreed. But on one condition. She wanted to see the doll destroyed. She wanted to be free, no matter the consequence. She said she was tired. Tired of being a vessel for forces she did not fully understand. Tired of carrying her family's burdens. Tired of existing in that limbo between life and death. If helping Catherine meant her end, she accepted that fate. Harold looked at Prosecutor Richard beside him. The 2 men stared at each other for several long seconds. Richard, thinking of his unconscious daughter, nodded. He was willing to take the risk. Harold took a deep breath and agreed to Nora's terms. But before destroying the doll, Nora had to act. They took her to Dr. Graham's house, where Catherine lay motionless. It was a strange procession. Nora in chains, flanked by 2 armed guards, walking through Marshall streets as residents gathered at windows and doorways, watching in silence. Some made the sign of the cross. Others spat on the ground. Children hid behind their mothers, terrified. At the doctor's house, Nora was taken to Catherine's room. The girl's mother tried to protest, but Richard held her back, urging calm. Nora approached the bed, chains jingling with each step. She looked at Catherine for a long moment, then held out her hands, revealing the marked palms. She placed her hands on Catherine's forehead and began to whisper words in that strange ancient language. The air in the room grew heavy. Candle flames flickered without wind. Harold felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. Nora's whisper intensified, becoming almost a chant. Her hands glowed with a faint bluish light from no visible source. Then Catherine opened her eyes. Catherine opened her eyes and took a deep breath, like someone surfacing after holding their breath too long. Her entire body shook once, violently. Then she looked around, disoriented. Her eyes found her mother's face first, then her father's, and finally settled on Nora. The girl did not scream. She showed no fear. She simply stared at the chained woman, with an expression far too ancient for a 12-year-old. Catherine's mother threw herself over her daughter, hugging her tightly, crying with relief. Richard held them both, unable to hold back his own tears. Dr. Graham quickly examined Catherine, checking her pulse, reflexes, breathing. Everything seemed normal, as if she had simply awakened from a deep, natural sleep. But everyone in the room knew there was nothing natural about what had just happened. Nora stepped back, her legs weakening. The guards caught her before she fell. She was pale, sweating coldly, breathing heavily. The ritual had sapped what little energy she had left. Harold ordered her taken back to jail, but before leaving, Nora turned to Richard and uttered 3 words. "Keep your promise." That night, Harold, Richard, and Dr. Thatcher gathered in the sheriff's office. The doll lay on the table, illuminated by the lamplight's yellow glow. The 3 men watched it as if it were a coiled snake. Thatcher repeated his warnings. Destroying the doll could kill Nora or free her. There was no way to know. The decision had to be made. Richard broke the silence. He said Nora had done her part. She had saved Catherine when under no obligation. She deserved her freedom, even if that freedom came through death. Harold agreed. Thatcher simply nodded, acknowledging forces at play beyond academic understanding. They decided to act at dawn the next day. They wanted Nora to know, to be prepared. Harold went to her cell and informed her. Nora received the news without visible emotion. She asked only for one thing, that when the time came, she could hold the doll, that the end would find her while connected to her lifelong anchor. Harold promised it would be so. The dawn of April 28, 1913, arrived cold and overcast. A dense fog blanketed Marshall's streets, turning buildings into indistinct shadows. Harold, Richard, Thatcher, and the church pastor gathered at Nora's cell. She sat in its center, no longer in the corner where she had spent weeks. Her back was straight. There was a dignity about her that had not existed before. Harold opened the cell, entered, and knelt before Nora, placing the doll in her hands. She held it carefully, as if it were precious. Her fingers traced the twisted branches, touched the sewn strands of hair, traced the engraved words she could not read, but somehow understood. She looked at Harold and whispered a thank you. Then she closed her eyes. Harold stepped back, leaving the cell. Thatcher held a torch. The plan was simple. They would throw the torch into the cell, setting the doll ablaze while Nora held it. The fire would consume the doll and consequently sever the bond. What happened next was in the hands of forces none of them understood. The pastor began to pray, his words echoing in the damp jail corridor. Thatcher brought the torch closer to the bars. The fire danced, casting shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Harold nodded. It was time. Thatcher threw the torch through the bars. It landed on the stone floor, inches from Nora and the doll. For a moment, nothing happened. The torch simply burned, its flame small and contained. Then Nora opened her eyes. She raised the doll above her head and plunged it into the flames. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The doll did not merely catch fire, it burst into blue and green flames, colors that should not exist in natural fire. The intense heat made everyone recoil. Nora began to scream, but it was not a scream of pain. It was something deeper, more primal, as if multiple voices were being torn from her at once. Her body arched backward impossibly, her spine bending at an angle that should have broken it. The symbols on her palms began to glow with the same blue light that had emanated from them when she healed Catherine. But now the light was more intense, blinding. The cell walls began to crack. Fissures spread across the stone like a spiderweb. The floor shook beneath the men's feet. Chunks of mortar fell from the ceiling. The pastor continued praying louder now, his voice competing with the deafening sound from the cell. Harold tried to enter, to do something, but Thatcher held him back. shouting that it was too late, that the process could not be stopped. The doll disintegrated in Nora's hands. The branches turned to ash. The hair became black smoke that spiraled upward. The engraved words glowed for a final moment before fading forever. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The fire died. The glow vanished. The tremors ceased. Utter silence fell over the jail. Nora lay motionless on the floor. Harold rushed into the cell, kneeling beside her. Her pulse was weak but present. She was breathing. She was alive. The doll's ashes were scattered around her, forming a perfect circle. Harold carried her out, laying her on a cot in the office. Dr. Graham was urgently summoned. For 3 days, Nora remained unconscious, but differently from Catherine's state. Nora seemed to be simply sleeping, resting deeply after extreme exhaustion. On the 4th day, she woke. When she opened her eyes, Harold, who had been keeping vigil in a nearby chair, saw something that surprised him. There was clarity in those eyes, a lucidity he had never seen before. Nora sat up slowly, looking around as if seeing the world for the first time. She looked at her hands. The symbols were still there, but they no longer glowed. They were just scars now, marks of something that had been, but was no more. She touched her face, her hair, as if recognizing herself. Harold asked how she felt. Nora took several minutes to answer, as if searching for words she had not used in a long time. She said she felt empty, but not in a bad way. Empty, like a vessel finally emptied, after carrying an impossible weight for years. She said the voices were gone. The constant whispering that had occupied her mind since childhood had quieted. For the first time in her life, her thoughts were her own. But with this freedom came something unexpected. Memory. A clear and complete memory of everything she had done. Of every person her family had taken to those mountains. Of every ritual performed in that hidden cabin. Of every moment when she was not herself, but merely an instrument of ancient, hungry forces. Tears began to stream down Nora's face. They were not tears of relief. They were tears of horror and remorse. She told everything, not in the fragmented, delirious manner of before, but linearly and coherently. She explained how her mother, Martha, had learned the ancient practices from her own grandmother, who in turn had learned from someone even more ancient. A lineage of forbidden knowledge dating back to a time when the mountains were inhabited by people who understood things modern civilization would rather forget. Martha had initiated Nora when she turned 7. The ritual left the marks on her palms and opened a channel. From that moment, Nora was no longer just a child. She was a bridge between the physical world and something existing deep within the earth, in the ancient roots of the mountains, in places light never reached. Whatever inhabited these places required tribute blood, life, vital energy. The Whitaker family became the providers of these tributes. They chose lone travelers, people who would not be urgently sought, those whose absence society would not immediately notice. They brought these people to the cabin. They performed rituals Nora could not fully describe, because when they occurred, she was not in control. The entities took over, using her body, her hands, her voice. In return, the family received protection. Their crops never failed. Their illnesses were cured. Their animals reproduced abundantly. Martha developed healing abilities that seemed miraculous. Samuel was never seriously injured despite the dangers of his lumber work. Thomas grew up strong and healthy. Even little Elizabeth, born premature and weak, survived against all odds. But there was a price beyond the physical toll. The humanity of each family member was slowly eroded. Samuel drank to forget what he did on new moon nights. Martha became more distant and colder, until her own husband barely recognized her. Thomas began to have violent nightmares, and Nora lost herself completely somewhere along the way. When Samuel arranged her marriage to James Mercer, Nora thought it might be a way out, a chance to escape that life. But the entities would not allow it so easily, and James proved to be as monstrous as anything that inhabited the mountain depths. His violence awakened something in Nora, or perhaps it gave the entities the excuse they needed. What happened that February night was as much revenge as it was ritual. Harold listened silently, making occasional notes. When Nora finished, he asked about her family. Where were they? Nora shook her head. She did not know. She said that when she was arrested, the bond that kept them connected was severed. They had likely fled, terrified of what might happen now that one of their own had been captured. But there was something more. Nora said that even with the doll destroyed and its connections severed, the entities still existed. They did not depend on her or the Whitaker family. The family was just one of many over the centuries. If it wasn't the Whitakers, it would be others. The mountains were ancient, and what lived in them was even older, possessing all the patience in the world. This revelation left Harold deeply disturbed. Nora's full confession was transcribed into 147 pages. Prosecutor Richard Ashford spent days reviewing every word, every detail, trying to find a way to fit it within the known laws. But how to judge someone who claimed to have been possessed by supernatural forces? How to convict a woman who now demonstrated genuine remorse for acts she committed without complete control of her own will? The case attracted nationwide attention. Journalists from New York, Boston, and even Chicago descended upon Marshall, transforming the small town into a kind of macabre circus. Makeshift hotels sprang up. Local merchants sold souvenirs. Some offered tours of the mountains, promising to show them the places where the bodies were found. The tragedy had become a spectacle. The trial was scheduled for early June. The prosecution would argue premeditated murder, the defense, temporary insanity. But everyone knew that the real trial was taking place on the streets, in churches, in whispered conversations between neighbors. Nora Whitaker had become a symbol. To some, she was a monster who deserved to be hanged. To others, a victim of circumstances beyond human comprehension. Meanwhile, Harold continued investigating. He could not accept that the Whitaker family had simply vanished without a trace. He organized systematic searches across the mountains, consulted records from other towns, and sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties. Weeks passed without any concrete leads. It was as if Samuel, Martha, Thomas, and Elizabeth had been swallowed by the forest. Then, in mid-May, a farmer from Tennessee near the North Carolina border appeared at the Marshall police station with a disturbing story. He said that 3 weeks earlier, he had found a woman and a girl wandering near his property. They were in deplorable condition, starving and wearing rags. The woman did not speak, just stared blankly into space. The girl cried constantly, asking for her brother. The farmer, whose name was Augustus Mills, had taken the two into his home. His wife cared for them, gave them food and clean clothes, and tried to find out where they came from. The girl eventually told him her name was Elizabeth, that she had gotten lost from her family in the mountains, that her brother Thomas had fallen off a cliff, and her father had gone after him, saying he would return, but never did. The woman, whom Augustus assumed was her mother, never regained her ability to speak. She would sit in a corner, rocking back and forth, just as Nora had done in the cell. When they tried to feed her, she would push the food away. When they tried to ask questions, she would just stare past people as if she could not see them. Augustus had kept the two on his property for weeks, unsure of what to do. It was not until a traveler passed by the farm and mentioned Marshall's case that he connected the dots. Elizabeth Whitaker, Martha Whitaker. He had both of them in his home. He immediately packed a wagon and traveled for 2 days until he reached Marshall. Harold left for Tennessee that same afternoon, accompanied by 2 deputies. They arrived at Augustus's farm at dusk. The 2 were in a back room. Elizabeth was asleep, huddled under a blanket. Martha was awake, sitting in a rocking chair, her eyes fixed on the wall. Harold approached her cautiously. He gave his name, said he was the Madison County Sheriff, and that he knew who she was. Martha did not react. Harold tried several times using different approaches, but it was like talking to a statue. Martha Whitaker's mind had completely shattered. Whatever had happened in the mountains after Nora's arrest had broken something essential within her. Harold gently woke Elizabeth. The girl was only 9, but her eyes held a frightening old age. She recognized Harold from the few times she had visited Hot Springs. When he asked what had happened, Elizabeth began to cry. Through sobs, she told him the story. The night Nora was arrested, the family felt it. They felt the bond break. They felt the entities protecting them withdraw. Samuel panicked. He said they needed to flee immediately, that without protection, they were vulnerable. They gathered only the essentials and set off in the middle of the night, following trails known only to them. They walked for days. They ate roots and drank water from icy streams. Martha began to act strangely after just 2 days. She stopped talking and just followed the others mechanically. Samuel grew increasingly nervous, constantly looking back as if he were being followed. Thomas tried to remain calm, caring for Elizabeth. It was on the 5th day that it happened. They were crossing a cliff face when Samuel suddenly stopped. He looked up at the sky, which was darkening with storm clouds, and began to laugh, a loud, hysterical laugh that echoed off the rocks. He said there was no point in running, that they had made a pact, that the entities would never let them go. Then Samuel ran toward the edge of the cliff. Thomas screamed and ran after his father, trying to hold him. The 2 struggled for a few seconds on the edge. Elizabeth watched in horror, unable to move. Martha remained motionless, unresponsive. Then both Samuel and Thomas fell. They simply disappeared over the edge, their screams swallowed by the wind. Elizabeth ran to the edge and looked down. It was a drop of over 50 meters. There was no way anyone could survive that fall. She returned to Martha, grabbed her mother's hand, and begged them to do something. But Martha did not respond. She was trapped inside her own mind, unreachable. The 2 wandered for days. Elizabeth did not know where to go. She tried to follow any trail she could find, hoping to reach some civilization. They ate wild berries whenever they could find them. They drank from any water source. They slept under trees. It was by pure luck that they eventually reached the Augustus Mills farm. Harold heard it all with a heavy heart. Samuel and Thomas Whitaker were dead. Martha was alive only in the biological sense, her mind having retreated to some inaccessible place. Elizabeth was the only functional survivor of the family, and she was just a traumatized child. He decided to take them both back to Marshall. Martha needed care that Augustus could not provide, and Elizabeth needed a safe place. The return trip was silent and difficult. Martha had to be gently tied to the wagon to keep from falling during the journey. Elizabeth stayed by Harold's side, hugging a small rag doll Augustus's wife had given her. By the time they reached Marshall, it was already night. Harold took the 2 of them straight to Dr. Graham's house. Nora was informed the next day. When she learned that her mother and sister were in town, she asked to see them. Harold hesitated, but eventually agreed under strict supervision. The meeting took place in the doctor's office. Nora entered the room accompanied by 2 guards. Elizabeth was sitting in a chair, Martha beside her in the rocking chair. When Elizabeth saw Nora, her face contorted with a mixture of relief and terror. She wanted to run to her sister, but she also wanted to run away. She froze, tears streaming down her face. Nora approached slowly, knelt before her younger sister, and simply embraced her. Elizabeth collapsed, crying convulsively, clinging to Nora as if she were about to drown. Nora looked at Martha. Her mother showed no recognition. She continued to rock in her chair, staring into space. Nora reached out and gently touched Martha's face. For a brief moment, just a second, there seemed to be a spark in Martha's eyes, a moment of recognition, of connection. Then it was gone, and Martha returned to her empty state. Nora whispered a plea for forgiveness. It was not clear if she was asking for forgiveness from her mother, her sister, or herself, perhaps all three. Harold allowed them to stay together for half an hour. When it was time for Nora to return to her cell, Elizabeth begged not to be taken. Harold had to gently separate the two, promising to arrange other visits. In the following days, difficult decisions had to be made. Martha was admitted to a nursing home in Asheville, an institution that cared for people with severe mental illness. Elizabeth had no one, no relatives who could care for her. Harold and his wife, Sarah, discussed it at length and decided to take the girl in temporarily. Their own daughter was the same age as Elizabeth. Perhaps the company would help them both recover from their recent traumas. Nora's trial was fast approaching. Dr. Thatcher returned to Chapel Hill, but left a lengthy report of his findings. He argued that Nora had been both a victim and a perpetrator, that the practices imposed on her since childhood had fundamentally altered her capacity for free choice. But the report also acknowledged that there was no legal precedent for such a defense. The question that tormented everyone was simple, but impossible to answer. Where did the entity's responsibility end and Nora's begin? Had she truly been merely a vessel, or had she on some level chosen to participate? The memories that now haunted her suggested some degree of awareness during the acts. But did awareness mean choice? Or could someone be aware and still be unable to resist? The jury would be made up of 12 men from Marshall and the surrounding area men who had seen the bodies being exhumed, who had heard the stories, who had felt the fear that gripped the town. Could these men judge impartially? Harold had his doubts. A week before the trial, something unexpected happened. Catherine Ashford asked to speak with Nora. The girl had fully recovered from the incident in the cave, at least physically. But she had memories of that time, strange, fragmented memories she could not fully explain. She wanted to understand. She wanted to hear from Nora what had really happened. Richard Ashford was reluctant, but his daughter insisted with a determination he could not ignore. The meeting was arranged again under supervision. Catherine entered the jail's visiting area, her hands nervously clutching the skirt of her dress. Nora stood on the other side of the bars, surprised to see the girl she had helped save. Catherine asked a simple question. "Why did you help me?" Nora took a moment to answer. She said that when she destroyed the doll and severed the connection, she felt for the first time in years something she had forgotten. Existed. Empathy. Humanity. The suffering of Catherine and her family was no different from the suffering of all the victims she and the Whitakers had caused. If there was a chance to redeem even a small fraction of the harm she had done, she had to try. Catherine then asked another question. What did I see when I was asleep? Nora closed her eyes. She said Catherine had been taken to a place between worlds, a space where ancient entities resided. The girl had seen things no human should see, forms that had no form, consciousnesses that existed before language, before thought as we know it. Catherine confirmed it was exactly like that. Impossible to describe, but impossible to forget. But there was something else Catherine wanted to know. She asked if those things were still out there, if they were still a threat. Nora was honest. She said yes, that they always would be, that they didn't depend on the Whitakers or any specific family. The mountains held secrets that stretched back to ages before the arrival of Europeans, even before the indigenous peoples who preceded them. Whatever dwelt in the depths was patient and eternal. Catherine absorbed this information with impressive maturity for her age. She thanked Nora for being honest and got up to leave. But before walking out the door, she turned one last time. She told Nora that she didn't hate her, that she understood, as far as anyone could, that complex situations don't have simple answers. Those words made Nora cry for the first time since she had regained her humanity. The trial would begin in 2 days. The first day of June, 1913, dawned with a heavy gray sky over Marshall. Low clouds covered the mountain peaks, and a cold wind swept through the valleys, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and pine. The small town was unrecognizable. Hundreds of people crowded the streets, coming from all over the state and beyond. The makeshift courtroom at the Methodist church was packed hours before the session began. Nora was brought in a closed car, escorted by 6 armed men, not because they feared she would try to escape, but because the crowd outside was divided and volatile. Some shouted for justice, demanding her immediate hanging. Others shouted words of support, saying she was as much a victim as anyone else. The tension was palpable, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with electricity about to discharge. Inside the church, silence fell as Nora entered. She wore a simple gray cotton dress borrowed from the sheriff's wife. Her hair was tied in a low bun. She walked with her head held high, but her eyes were downcast. She sat next to her attorney, a man named Jonathan Pierce, who had come from Asheville specifically for this case. The judge was a 63-year-old man named Henry Morrison, known for his strictness, but also for his fairness. He banged his gavel, and the session began. Prosecutor Richard Ashford presented his charges: premeditated murder of James Mercer, conspiracy in the murders of at least 10 other identified victims, concealment of bodies. The charges were serious enough to warrant the death penalty. The defense attorney argued temporary insanity caused by prolonged trauma and psychological manipulation since childhood. He presented Dr. Thatcher's report. He called witnesses who spoke about James Mercer's violent nature, Nora's bruises, and the conditions in which she lived. He called Dr. Graham to testify about the old scars on her body, marks of abuse dating back years before her marriage. The trial lasted 4 full days. Witness after witness took the stand. Elijah Parsons described what he found in James's house. Peter Sullivan, the night watchman, recounted Nora's disturbing confession that morning. Dr. Vincent Graham explained the medical findings in language everyone could understand. Augustus Mills spoke about Martha and Elizabeth's condition when he found them. But the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Nora would be called to testify. The silence that fell over the church when she stood was absolute. Every person present held their breath. Nora walked to the platform with slow but steady steps. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Jonathan Pierce conducted the initial interrogation carefully. He guided her through her childhood, the rituals, the forced marriage, and James's violence. Nora answered each question clearly, without trying to evade or embellish the facts. She admitted to killing James. She admitted to participating in other crimes along with her family. But she also explained the nature of her participation, the lack of real control over her actions during the rituals. Then came the cross-examination. Richard Ashford was a fair man, but he was also a prosecutor doing his job. He pressed Nora with difficult questions. If she was being controlled, how did she explain her moments of lucidity? If she had no choice, why hadn't she asked for help sooner? How could he be sure she wasn't simply using the entity story as a convenient excuse? Nora didn't shy away from the questions. She acknowledged that she didn't have satisfactory answers to all of them. She said the line between being controlled and participating voluntarily had become so blurred over the years that she herself could no longer distinguish it. That perhaps there were times when she could have resisted more. But the fear and indoctrination were so deep that resistance seemed impossible. She wasn't asking for absolution, just understanding. Then something extraordinary happened. Catherine Ashford stood up in the middle of the hearing. Her father tried to sit her down, but she broke free and walked to the front of the church. Judge Morrison started to protest, but something about the 12-year-old's determination made him pause. Catherine asked permission to speak. After a hesitation, the judge granted it. Catherine turned to the jury in a voice that was young but held unshakable conviction. She said she had been to the place between worlds, that she had seen the things that dwelt in the depths, that no human being exposed to that could emerge unscathed. She said Nora had the courage to break the bond, even though she knew she might die in the process, that she had used the last sparks of that terrible connection to save her when she had no obligation to do so. Catherine looked directly at the jury and said something that would echo for generations in that community. She said that if they sentenced Nora to death, they would be killing the only person who had been strong enough to break a cycle of horror that had lasted centuries. That they would be telling future victims of manipulation and abuse that there was no redemption possible, no matter how sincere their repentance. Catherine's father was pale. Other audience members wept openly. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, clearly moved, and thanked Catherine for her words. He then declared a recess until the next day for closing arguments. That night, the city of Marshall seemed to be holding its breath. Conversations were taking place everywhere, in taverns, in homes, on the streets. People debated, argued, and reflected. Some changed their minds after hearing Catherine. Others remained convinced that justice demanded maximum punishment. Harold Benson didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, staring out the window at the dark mountains, thinking about everything he had witnessed in the past few months. The fourth and final day of the trial arrived. Closing arguments were presented. Richard Ashford argued passionately that the law needed to be respected, that allowing emotion to replace justice was dangerous. Jonathan Pierce argued that true justice needed to consider context, that punishing without understanding was revenge, not justice. The jury retired for deliberation at noon. The hours that followed were the longest Marshall had ever experienced. People lingered in the church and on the surrounding streets waiting. Elizabeth Whitaker sat with Sheriff Harold's family. She held the hand of his daughter, Sarah. Both girls were bound together by traumas no one their age should have to endure. It took 7 hours of deliberation. When the jury finally returned, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, tinting the sky with deep oranges and purples. The jury foreman was a 50-year-old farmer named Marcus Webb. His hands shook slightly as he held the verdict sheet. Judge Morrison asked if they had reached a verdict. Marcus confirmed that they had. The church was completely silent. Even the small children seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Marcus read aloud. Regarding James Mercer's premeditated murder charge, the jury found Nora Whitaker guilty of murder, but under extremely extenuating circumstances. As for the other charges related to the victims found in the mountains, the jury could not in good conscience convict her as solely responsible, recognizing that she had been a victim of manipulation and control since childhood. The jury's recommendation was commitment to an appropriate institution for treatment, not execution. Relief and disappointment spread through the church in almost visible waves. Some applauded, others left in protest. Nora sat motionless, as if unable to fully process what she had just heard. She wouldn't be hanged, but she wouldn't be free either. Judge Morrison considered the jury's recommendation carefully. He declared that Nora Whitaker would be sentenced to life in the state hospital for the insane in Morganton. There she would receive treatment and remain in custody for the rest of her life. It wasn't freedom, but it was life. It was a chance, however slim. Nora was transported to Morganton 2 weeks later. Elizabeth visited her before her departure. The two sisters embraced for long, wordless minutes. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Elizabeth would stay with Sheriff Harold's family, who formalized the adoption months later. The girl would have as much of a normal childhood as possible under the circumstances. Martha remained in the asylum in Asheville. She would live there for another 17 years, never regaining the ability to speak or recognize anyone. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1930, taking with her secrets that would never be revealed. The bodies of Samuel and Thomas Whitaker were never recovered. The cliff they fell from was too steep, the forest below too dense. Eventually, nature reclaimed what was hers, as it always does in those ancient mountains. Nora lived in Morganton for 23 years. Over time, she became a calm presence at the institution. She helped care for other patients, worked in the garden, and participated in therapy sessions with a genuine desire to improve. The doctors who treated her wrote extensively about her case, fascinated by the transformation they witnessed. She never spoke of the entities or the rituals again. When questioned, she simply said that they belonged to the past, and the past was best left where it was. She died in 1936 at the age of 46 from pneumonia. Her last request was to be buried away from the mountains. That request was granted. She rests in a small cemetery in Morganton, beneath a simple headstone that lists only her name and her birth and death dates. Elizabeth Whitaker grew up to become a teacher. She married a kind man, had 3 children, and lived a long and seemingly normal life. But those who knew her well said she never slept completely, that there was always a watchfulness in her eyes, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. She never returned to the Appalachian Mountains. She never spoke of her original family with her own children. Some secrets, she decided, were too heavy to pass on. The mountain cabin where the rituals took place was never found again. Thomas Edison, the hunter who discovered it, tried to return several times, but could never locate the same place. It was as if the forest had swallowed that space, hiding it once again. Perhaps it's for the best. Marshall eventually returned to normal, as much as a town can return to normal after events like these. The stories endured, of course. They became local legends. Parents told softened versions to their children on winter nights. Tourists occasionally showed up searching for the sites where the bodies were found. But as the decades passed, truth and fiction blurred until they became indistinguishable. The Nora Whitaker case remains in the Madison County archives to this day. Documents yellowed with age, faded photographs, testimonies transcribed in ancient handwriting. Historians occasionally revisit it, trying to understand what really happened that winter of 1913. But the more one studies it, the more questions arise, some without satisfactory answers. The mountains remain ancient, silent, guarding their secrets in the depths where light cannot reach. Hunters still occasionally get lost on those trails. Travelers still report strange sensations in certain clearings. And on moonless nights, when the wind blows through the pines with a sound that almost resembles language, the older residents lock their doors and shutters because they know. They know that some things are older than human memory, that some places hold echoes of practices that predate civilization, and that the mountains, patient and eternal, continue to wait, always waiting. The horrific case of Nora Whitaker reminds us that the line between victim and perpetrator is not always clear. That true justice requires not just punishment, but understanding, and that even in the darkest places, there is always the possibility of redemption for those brave enough to seek it. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of the most disturbing mysteries in American history, leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story. Each case we cover carries deep layers of humanity, terror, and mystery. If these dark stories from the past pique your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the future cases we'll uncover together. There are so many secrets still buried in the forgotten pages of history, waiting to be told until the next investigation.